Colonel Macgregor, it's such a pleasure to be able to talk with you today. And let's start off at the beginning. What was the original conception of the special military operation in terms of its goals and the net assessment that allowed Putin to initiate it?
Yeah, I think President Putin decided that all of his efforts to talk us into some level of understanding had failed. And having failed to persuade us that Russia would not tolerate NATO membership for Ukraine and would not tolerate the eventual positioning of NATO forces, especially NATO missiles, long-range strike weapons in eastern Ukraine, led him to conclude he had to go in and demonstrate just how serious he was. I think he made a number of assumptions about how this would work out that turned out to be invalid. One of his assumptions was that the United States, in particular, the leadership in Washington, as well as the leadership in Kiev, would want to negotiate, that they would want to avoid a wider war. I don't think he was prepared for what turned out to be the opposite. So the first going-in proposition was, we're going in with limited numbers of troops. We're going a short distance into eastern Ukraine, principally into those areas where the majority of the population speaks Russian. And we plan to demonstrate that we are serious and we want to negotiate. And he outlines certain things that he wanted. Number one, obviously, Ukraine had to be neutral, not a member of NATO. Neutrality. Didn't go into great detail about what that neutrality would mean, but probably something close to Austria or Finland. Secondly, he thought, well, there are two provinces that are, or oblasts, whatever you want to call them, that are breakaway, Donetsk and Luhansk. And they should have the right to live as Russians inside Ukraine, have equal rights as Ukrainian citizens, enjoy some measure of autonomy. And then, of course, there's the issue of Crimea. Please recognize the legitimacy of Russian control of Crimea, which, from the standpoint of the Russians, having conquered it in the 1770s, is a self-evident truth. Now, in addition to that, he also talked about eventually having a Russian representative sit on the equivalent of the Ukrainian National Security Council, simply as a representative of Russian interests to that Security Council. That's about it.
So he would have been not happy, but satisfied with that as an outcome.
Yes. And I think he was quite surprised that there was no real willingness to seriously consider it. Now, we do have evidence towards the end of March, after the war had been going on for 6 weeks, that Mr. Zelensky said, well, we could live with neutrality. And when that word seems to have reached Washington and London,
Boris Johnson,
people became incensed, and Boris Johnson represented Washington's interests and said, absolutely not. We will support you to the bitter end. You must stand your ground and fight for every inch of Ukraine.
Well, apropos of this, why did Mr. Putin believe that this would work? The U.S. had been training up essentially a ersatz NATO force, the second strongest army in Europe after Russia, up to NATO standards, and had spent billions on this enterprise. Now, why would Putin not take that into account?
I think there are several reasons. First of all, Vladimir Putin, unlike his predecessors, really does know something about the West. If we go back through many Soviet and Russian leaders over centuries, very few had actually traveled outside of their homeland. That's not the case with Vladimir Putin. And he is predisposed to cooperate with the West, not just on a business level, but also in a cultural sense.
His record shows that.
So that was part of it. Secondly, he did not want to convey the impression that there was anything Soviet-like about the current state. And so he was not going to send forces into Ukraine that would be destructive.
You mean like Hungary in 56?
Of course. And he gave strict orders to the forces that went in there. I don't want you to kill civilians. I want you to minimize losses in the civilian population. Try not to destroy infrastructure. And I think his assumption was that we would somehow or another figure out what his intentions were. We were never really interested in his intentions. In fact, from our vantage point, I think we thought this war was manna from heaven. That this was a war that this new Ukrainian army that we'd invested so heavily in could win. And we mistook, the underlying assumptions that shaped the initial operation as evidence for weakness.
So the initial operation that was supposed to be completed within a few weeks turned out to be, in effect, the initial phase of a longer war. And at what point did the Russians and Mr. Putin realize that the Ukrainians, being persuaded to fight what amounts to, from their perspective, total war, did Russia decide to recalibrate?
You know, that's a question that's tough to answer without seeing the actual transcripts of the meetings that were conducted. But we know that in April and May there were several meetings and several discussions, because the feedback that was coming from Ukraine, from the Russians living in Ukraine, was very interesting. Because the Russian troops told them, well, we're here to liberate you, but we're not staying. And so the Russian-speaking population said, well, if you're not going to stay, as soon as you leave, if we cooperate with you, the Ukrainian secret police that we call the SBU will come here, shoot all of us in the head.
And this happened.
Yeah. So if you're not going to stay, literally, the hell with you. We're not going to support it. This became increasingly obvious as the war drew on, and that was the first thing. The second thing was we sent very hostile signals. You go back to March and listen to President Biden's speech, which was the famous regime change speech by accident, that until Putin is removed and this state is transformed into something that meets our standards, there can be no peace. And I think it took a while for that to sink in. And suddenly, by the beginning of the summer, it was very clear that what they had done would not secure Russia.
So what you're describing is not something that Americans really understand, is that when the initial phase essentially ran into a brick wall, there was a transitional period of maybe 6 to 8 weeks in which the Russians recalibrated and reassessed their situation. And then from what we've discussed, they went into a strategic defensive mode in which they held the territory they'd taken in the south, consolidated it by taking Mariupol and then the Lysychansk and Severodonetsk conurbation, and manned it with a relatively small force, a kind of economy of force operation.
Yes, they never had more than 20% of their ground force engaged.
Right.
And that is a very small contingent, about 190,000 troops initially. And then it became clear that that was going to be inadequate because the war was not going to end with the capture of these territories.
Right.
So there, at some point in the summer, there was a meeting between the General Staff, the Stavka, and I think President Putin. And his question was, well, what do we have to do to win this war and end it?
Right. Because
the key issue is not just we want to win on the battlefield. We want to win in such a way as we bring this war to a close.
Right. And although severe casualties had been inflicted on the Ukrainian army, the original Ukrainian army, the U.S. and Britain were very active in training and equipping new cadre of Ukrainian into effective forces, and this began to be demonstrated in the end of August and into September and October.
Well, people were always shown these marvelous films of Russian tanks being destroyed by various things, Javelin missiles, and of course the one weapon system the British are using, this light anti-tank weapon system, which is really very, very good. It's turned out to be much more effective than the Javelin, based on the reports coming in. And the Russians looked at all of this and said, well, Mr. President, if you want us to win this and bring this to a close, we have to make fundamental change in all of the assumptions.
Right.
And first and foremost, we have to move over to the strategic defensive. And this is going to have to be, for the time being, an economy of force operation because we don't have enough forces. Not only are you going to have to bring in most of the regular army, the active force, we're going to need additional reservists and volunteers. What's really interesting on the Russian side is the enormous success which they've had with volunteers, not just Chechnya, but also within Russia itself. So this changed the character, but then the decision was, well, if we're going to hold this territory, and this is when Surovikin is named the new commander, he said, I'm happy to hold this territory, but I don't want to be committed to holding every inch of this.
Right.
If I feel it's necessary to withdraw somewhere to economize so that I could be more successful elsewhere, I want to be able to do that. And President Putin said, you are now the theater commander. You are in command. Everyone takes orders from you. So there was a restructuring of the commands to ensure that he was now the final say on any operational item that occurred in the theater. That was not the case earlier.
So the second phase, which was marked initially by an adaptation to the circumstances that the Russians found themselves in, actually evolved during the course of this phase into something more productive than simply holding the line.
Oh, absolutely.
And this is somewhat reminiscent to me of the withdrawal of the German army, which was also outnumbered in World War I, to the so-called Hindenburg Line in 1917, where what the Russians did, the Germans, did is leave a barren wasteland that was full of obstacles and mines and pull back to a position that shortened the front and allowed them to build up a larger strategic reserve. And it seems to me that what you're suggesting is that Surovikin sort of deliberately did this in both the part of the Kharkiv Oblast and also in Kherson Oblast.
Yeah, well, the Russians have an advantage, though, over us in this sense. They understand that ground in and of itself has no real value unless it confers a military advantage on you.
Right.
There's no point in just holding onto ground for the sake of saying, well, here on the map I've drawn a line and I'll go no further, which, of course, was the Hitlerian mistake that lost the war in the East, or one of them.
Right.
And the bottom line is, he said, look, we're not going to defend something that we can easily retake when we decide it's necessary. We're going to stay where we think we can defend effectively. And so for weeks I was being asked by people, well, the Russians withdrew 10 kilometers here, they withdrew 20 here, and so aren't they in retreat? Is this not evidence for Russian decay and a crumbling defense? Never. It never was. But all of these things were approved by Surovikin. He made it very clear that local commanders had authority to do what made sense, but he was still in command, and these decisions had to be checked with him.